G'day and welcome to Bens Worx. On this week's episode, we're going to make a dragon egg without using a lathe. During this tutorial, you'll see me using a disc sander like this, but if you don't have one but you do have a belt sander, just turn it upside down in the vise and you'll be able to use it the same way. And if you don't have a belt sander, you could even use an orbital sander. I'll also be using my drill press, but if you guys don't have one of these, you can grab yourself a cordless drill. Now I've just put a zip tie around the handle here, and I can bring that up and hold it around the trigger to keep it on. Then you can put this in your vise and it'll work the same way. So they're the two major tools you guys will need to make this egg, but first we need to cast it, so let's get on with the build. The first step is to take your mould. I'm using a plastic cup and trace the bottom onto your piece of timber. Now I'm using my bandsaw to cut it out, but if you don't have one, you can easily use a handsaw. Now that we have our starting piece, we're off to the sander. Here I'm shaping the wood until I got a nice tight fit in the bottom of the cup. To clean the wood, I'm just using a wire brush just to remove any loose pieces. For this egg, I'm going to coat the burl in a chameleon pigment from Solar Colour Dust. This pigment colour shifts to 4 different colours. To get the best results, it's recommended to apply the pigment to a dark base, so I'm painting the wood black by using some acrylic paint. Now for the fun part, colouring the wood, but first I need to pour some UV resin into a cup. Now I'll add the pigment to the UV resin and mix together. The more pigment you use, the better the results will be. Now I'll just paint the pigment on by using a paintbrush. You can see how good the colour shifts from purple to copper. Before casting the wood in resin, we need to cure the UV resin, and I do that with a UV torch. If you don't have a torch, you can leave it out in the sun for 15 minutes. If you want to try these pigments for yourself, you can grab a 5% discount by using code word BENSWORX. Now grab your cup and we're going to glue the wood down so it doesn't float. The resin I'm using is a casting resin from Just Resin. This slow set resin is mixed at a ratio of 3:1. Make sure that when you mix your resin, you scrape the sides and the bottom and mix for at least 2 minutes. When pouring the resin, make sure you pour nice and slow to reduce the amount of bubbles. I'll be using a pressure pot to help eliminate the bubbles, but if you don't have one, don't worry, it'll still cure. You may be left with some tiny bubbles. I left the blank to cure for 4 hours, and as you can see, it's a perfect cast. Now carefully cut away the plastic cup. Now I'm going to mark the center so I can attach the mounting block. The mounting block I'm using is a piece of 1-inch dowel, and I've trimmed down the end so it'll fit in a drill. To glue on the mounting block, I'm using some 5-minute epoxy. Try to position it as close to center as possible. Because I'll be putting a lot of pressure on the blank, I'm going to let this harden overnight. It's now the next day and it's time for a test run. My original plan was to turn the blank by using the drill, but as you'll see, things just don't go to plan. It was jumping around way too much. I persisted for a while, but it just wasn't working. I decided to remove the blank from the drill and freehand it. Surprisingly, this worked quite well. I kept cleaning the disc as the fine resin dust was just clogging it up. I took my time and shaped it into an egg. Every so often I would stop and check the shape. Once I got close to the egg shape, I went back to the drill to smooth out the lumps. Once I was happy with the shape, I took it to the drill press to fine tune the shape. Because I want to shape it some more, I'll be starting with 40 grit sandpaper. I worked my way through the grits until I was happy with the shape. Now I'm switching to wet and dry sandpaper and starting at 400 grit, then I'll go to 600, 800 and 1200. To protect my drill press from the water, I'm just going to cover it in an old towel. When sanding resin, try and keep your sandpaper cool by dipping it in water. This also helps clean the paper. I found holding my finger underneath helps steady the egg. Keep a rag handy, that way you can keep wiping down the egg. It's also a good idea to keep changing the dirty water. I finished sanding with 1200 grit and it was looking really good. All the scratches had been sanded out. To help start the polishing process, I also used some 5000 grit sandpaper. To polish, I'll be using a polishing pad with some car polish. Now this works quite well, but fortunately for me, I have a buffing wheel. The final step is to cut off the mounting block and clean up the base of the egg. I'll be using my bandsaw, but it's easily done with a handsaw. After sanding smooth the base, I'll give it one final polish. Well guys, what do you think of the no lathe egg? This thing turned out amazing. I was so surprised how easy it was to shape on the sander, and then to fine tune it on the drill press and polish was super easy. You can see that the shape of the egg isn't quite perfect. I really should have spent more time on the sander, but it still turned out really nice. And how good do the colour shifting pigments look? It really has a strong look of gold and purple. Even though the shape of this egg isn't quite perfect, I still think it's a great looking egg. I'm going to have this one for sale on my Etsy store. I'll leave a link in the description. Well, that's all for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.